Well, I had to take a bit of a medical layback this first part of the semester, but I mean, for the most part, it's separated by timber and everything else. We just wanted to get this done for a minute while I was having to focus on some areas. But it's at the point now that he just has to go through and say, good job, let's go ahead and start classifying and, put it into typology. About the only thing, like on the rim, there's the one sideways chevron.
We would like to thank you for attending our lecture series. This is one of our many free lectures that we provide on Sunday, the first Saturday of every month. We try to make sure we have something fun and interesting for the community. And my name is April Nye. I'm the Museum Operations Manager. And I would like to introduce a few people here to you. Michaelina. And she is from the TVA and will be sharing some things with us, as well as Dr. Jay Franklin from ETSU. So thank you.
My name is Michaelin. I'm an archaeologist with Tennessee Valley Authority. Erin Pritchard was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately she had a family emergency and could not make it. So I'm here in her seat, and hopefully, I found out at the last minute, so hopefully I'm not too terrible at this. But basically what I wanted to talk to you about today is some of the issues that we have at TVA of protecting our archaeological resources and historic sites, historic structures on TVA managed land, and some of the success that we've had in doing so. Let's see. TVA region, we serve power, as probably a lot of you know, we serve power to about 9 million people. And we cross 7 states. We're responsible for 46 reservoirs, about 29 hydropower units, 3 nuclear power plants, multiple combined cycle gas units, and fossil plants. Within that area, so we are one of the largest public utilities in the country. So that means we are, of course, a federal agency and therefore responsible for federal laws, including ones that govern the protection of historic resources and archaeological resources. Within that, then, a lot of times we hear about TVA's role in power generation, but we do not hear about their stewardship responsibilities too. TVA is responsible for approximately 293,000 acres of public land. That's just the ones that is not, that's above pool. We also have about 470,000 acres of inundated land along the Tennessee River and its major tributaries. Within that, then, we have systematically surveyed for archaeological resources, which is required under the National Historic Preservation Act to know and identify where our sites are, archaeological sites and historic structures, so that we can protect them. Given the amount of land, we know that we probably surveyed approximately only 30% of that land. But within that 30%, we have about 11,500 known archaeological resources or sites. So as I said, as a federal agency, TVA is responsible for all these relevant laws and regulations that govern the protection of these sites. Unfortunately, we do not receive federal appropriations, so most of the money that comes or all the money that comes from that is used to do this is through power generation. So some of the things that we're dealing with when we talk about the protection of sites within TVA land is obviously we have a large area of coverage. You saw the amount of acres. Now this is not as much as, say, the Bureau of Land Management or the National Park Service, but it is dispersed, and it's very highly dense. Obviously, we have land that's along the Tennessee River and its major tributaries, places that people just happen to love to live over the last 12,000 years. So one of the ongoing things that we always say about our land is that famous archaeologists from the 1930s said there are two sites on the Tennessee River, the right bank and the left bank. You can imagine the density of those. They're just, it's incredible. Like I said, we have 11,500 that just that we know about. As other federal agency, we have only limited time and limited resources. We only have 5 staff members that are responsible for protecting this land, and as everyone knows, money is tight, and it's often costly. And then erosion is a big problem. As I said, most of these sites are along the Tennessee River and its major tributaries, so just the actions from TVA reservoir operations in and itself, and then large boats and barges going by, increases that erosion. So you can see here that there's archaeological sites that are eroding out of the bank. And then one of the most, the biggest difficulties we face as far as protecting these sites are illegal excavations by people that are looting archaeological sites, and also surface collecting. And people go out, especially during winter drawdown, a lot of people go out as a hobby and collect these artifacts, and hopefully we'll talk about, and Dr. Franklin will talk about the importance of these artifacts and what they can tell you even when they're at surface. So just a little quickly to go over a little background of some of the laws that TVA is responsible for that govern the protection of historic sites and archaeological sites. One is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Any of you that own maybe property along Boone Lake and have had to come to us for a permit, us issuing a permit is for a dock, for stabilization. That is a federal action. And because it's a federal action, we need to take into account, per Section 106, the effect that might have on an archaeological site or a historic structure. So we review all permits that come through our office as far as how it would impact an archaeological site. And then our own, of course, our own operations we have to review for Section 106. So that could be anywhere from building a new power generating facility, to building new transmission lines, to even updating certain dams that are eligible for the National Register. So within our office alone, we probably review about 1,200 to 1,600 projects a year just for Section 106. So this really takes up the most time and our most resources doing that. We also have a pretty healthy preservation program that's getting geared up. So we've just started, and we're really excited about this, developing a database. So a lot of these sites and a lot of the area we surveyed are buried in files, buried in old reports, and we don't have like a systematic coverage within a database of how much land has actually been surveyed. The 30% is just an estimate, or how much archaeological sites we really know about. So it makes it even more difficult to manage these sites. So we're actively trying to update our database to get that set up. And then also under the National Historic Preservation Act, as I said, we're required to survey our land. So every year we conduct surveys within portions of our land that have not been surveyed yet to identify resources. And also do things like nominate archaeological sites or significant historic structures to the National Register. So one that we're working on now is this site down here in the Chickamauga Basin, Owasso Island. That's a multi-mound site that was occupied from about 900 AD to about 1400 AD, and it is a large village site. Also, we are required by federal laws to consult with federally recognized tribes. I believe, and I'm always wrong on the number, I think it's 17 federally recognized tribes that we consult with probably on a weekly basis, both with our 106 projects and then also our preservation program activities, and as I will talk about, our activities involving the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or protecting sites. They obviously have an active interest in the kind of work that we do of protecting sites. So not only is it required by federal law, but we also recognize how important it is to get the tribes involved in what we are doing, what our activities are, what is important to them as far as what kind of sites we're protecting, what we're looking at, and also, as archaeologists have learned, just the dialogue that occurs between tribal members and archaeologists has been very fruitful as far as active research interests. Now, one of the things that is a major concern to them is the destruction of archaeological sites. The law that covers that is the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. This was, or what we call ARPA, this was passed in 1979 as a recognition that we were losing a lot of archaeological sites rapidly, and a lot of our cultural heritage because of the destruction of these sites for a public profit, for private profit. So this was passed, and there's a couple things that fall under ARPA. One, it makes it that you, in order to conduct archaeological research on federal property, that you need to receive a permit from that federal agency. The second one is that it requires public outreach. So it requires federal agencies to set up public outreach programs in order to convey the importance of protecting these archaeological sites. And then also, and probably most importantly, it makes it illegal to excavate, remove, damage, deface, or even attempt to excavate, remove, damage, or deface an archaeological site. And it's very specific in what it is. It's of anything that's over 100 years old, and of what they call archaeological interest. So one of the effects we see on looting is that what we're losing when people go into archaeological sites is the context. And some of you might have more than a passing background in archaeology, so you really understand this concept. But for some of you that don't, let me just go into real quickly what that means. It's not just about the object itself that researchers want to know about, that archaeologists can tell about the past. It's about the relationship of those objects in space, in their relationship with other objects. So that's really what archaeologists are looking for. So are you finding within a large feature, are you finding a lot of pottery that's highly elaborate, that could suggest a ceremonial area, or are you finding pottery that's associated together that's more utilitarian in use, that would be associated with more of a household area? So it's about those relationships of those objects that are important. So when some of that is removed from illegal activity, you're really losing the information of what that site can provide you. So just as an example, so it's not about just this point, but where this point was found in space. That's really meaningful to archaeologists. And the artifacts themselves, even on surface, they can provide us important information about, it might be the only evidence we have of that there was a site there was human activity there. It's used to determine the age of sites because different artifacts, different styles change through time, much like, wardrobes change through time. It could indicate the culture that used that site, as Dr. Franklin is going to talk about. Just the pottery styles alone can talk about different cultural groups, different ethnic groups, different time periods that may have come through. And basically the material, the object could tell where the people who created the site searched for their supplies and resources. And just another example of what happens when you have illegal activities. So this is what this is an archaeological, plan view of an archaeological investigation, as you can see here, that they identified a rectangular structure that was associated with this site, and they interpreted some of the information they interpreted out looking at these stains on the ground and what that means as far as that reconstruction of that structure. But imagine, and oftentimes this is what we see at archaeological sites on TVA land, is that somebody had previously gotten in there to look for artifacts to sell, and this is all we're left with. So you can see the interpretation that archaeologists would have based on this versus this would be a lot different. So it almost looks like now you've got a circular structure instead of a rectangular structure. And what that means is important because even the shapes of structures can tell you a lot about time periods, about different activity use areas. So in 2006, TVA really ramped up its ARPA program. We now have full-time ARPA investigators that patrol areas looking for sites. Now, obviously, it's limited resources for our entire river and Tennessee River system, but they also work in conjunction with local law enforcement, with Marine police, so they're really good at reaching out and working with other groups. And then we have 5 trained archaeologists that also work with TVA that work on protecting the sites. So there's different kinds of enforcement that we do under ARPA. The one that we focus on the most is criminal activity. These are people that are purposely going to sites, digging up sites, looking for, or digging along the bank, looking for artifacts that they can sell for profit, or even collect themselves, but they are purposely looking for these areas to dig up. And then we also have civil, which is a lot of times, as I said, you need a permit to do a lot of things on TVA land, build a dock, put stabilization in. Some people decide that they're not going to bother with a permit, that they're just going to go ahead and do it because I don't want to pay for that pesky fee or for review, so they'll go in, do the work, and ask forgiveness later. In the meantime, they've blown through an archaeological site. So this comes with penalties as well. And then theft of government property, which this is what most of the time first offenses that we catch people out there the first time, or surface collecting, because ARPA, as I said, does have a provision, we call it the Boy Scout provision, that you are allowed to pick up projectile points to surface collect projectile points, and just projectile points or arrowheads, but we still cover it under theft of government property, so you will get fined for it, because as I'll show you a photograph, you can do a lot of damage just surface collecting. Okay, and I just wanted to show you some of the things that we see as far as destruction of archaeological site. Can you see the potholes within this site? Let's see. Right here, and we see this all the time in archaeological sites. And basically what they're doing is digging holes, looking for a lot of times burials, because that's where they have the most highly rich artifacts. So we have all over down the Tennessee River and throughout the tributaries, we have archaeological sites that have been pockmarked due to looting activities. And then you can see here a lot of times what they'll do is within banks, along banks, because you see the shell, that's indication of a shell minnow, indication of an archaeological site. And a lot of times those shell minnows, again, have burials in them. That means that they have artifacts that would be that they could sell on the black market. And they'll dig into the side of the bank, and as I said, we already have issues just with normal reservation operations of erosion of archaeological sites, but what this is doing is undercutting the vegetation, undercutting the bank, then we're losing even more of that site due to erosion. So it's a vicious cycle of looting, erosion, looting, erosion. And right here you can see we have a sign that's right up here of, it's an Archaeological Resource Protection Act sign that says it is illegal to excavate on federal property, excavate archaeological sites on federal property. And there was somebody standing right down here below the sign digging into the site. So he was caught, and of course when we took him to court, he could not argue that he didn't know it was illegal because he was standing right below the sign. And then we do, as I said, we do go after surface collectors, sometimes with a warning, sometimes with a misdemeanor charge of theft of government property. This individual was caught surface collecting. He had over 300 artifacts in his bucket. And so we've been successful in prosecuting, especially, like I said, we go after the most egregious acts, the ones that are really destroying archaeological sites. 9 cases in this fiscal year, 9 cases have been brought before a judge. 9 were successfully convicted as misdemeanors. Now, a lot of times, first offense, we go through a misdemeanor, even if it's usually, if it's anything more than damages more than $500, it is considered a felony. Now, most of the time with archaeological sites, it's always over more than $500. So it's almost always a felony, but a lot of times first-time offenders will go after a misdemeanor. Second time, it's an automatic felony if they're caught. And we also have 9 pending cases. These are large-scale, big time. They were in TVA. They were with the within looting in the national parks. That it involves 24 suspects. And every time we get a conviction, TVA releases a news release letting people know, just to let people know that, hey, we are enforcing this law and you need to know about this, that this is illegal. So we, as I will show you in a second, we do try to have a public outreach component to it to let people know that, you know, this is something that will not be tolerated. So we have been successful with small time looting. Now there are some major cases that people are constantly hitting archaeological sites over and over again, and we are still actively trying to find some of these people that are big time looters that do this for basically a living. So we had, and some of the areas that we have not been successful for, we've had people breach gates that we've spent a lot of money to protect. Is a highly significant, well-known site that is probably one of the most important sites in the southeast. The cave was breached. They got into about 9 burials, completely destroyed and broken up bones everywhere. Did probably about $100,000 worth of damage within that. Large-scale excavation of archaeological sites that are occurring at night. They're bringing in generators. Obviously, we can't be there all the time. And then now, a lot of times what we saw is that our major problem was during winter drawdown, but now we have people that are actually diving for archaeological sites that they know of. That makes it very hard for them to for us to catch them. So some of the things that we do in order to protect sites is stabilize them. Obviously, if they're rocked, then it's a lot harder for people to get onto the bank and to get at those sites. And then also, as you can see here, gating the sites, gating cave sites, putting things like that, barriers involved so they cannot get to the site. But as this is highly expensive, we have been successful in this, but rocking sites is highly expensive, and like I said, we have limited resources. And you know, the same thing with gating caves, and as I said, it's not completely foolproof. People have been able to breach those, both the stabilization and other types of barriers. just to show you an example of where we have been successful, this site here was heavily looted, and actually there was a guy on a boat that had a generator that had a pressure washer that was pressuring all along the site to get as much artifacts out as he could, including burials. So along the bank you could see burials split in half and the cutback coming out. And so we have been able to rock this site, and we put so much rock on it that nobody's ever going to get to that bank again. So we have done things like that, but as I said, it's not as successful as we would like it to be, and it is cost prohibitive a lot of times. So what are we to do? Well, a lot of people think, and including us at TVA, and that's one of the reasons we're here, is that public outreach is our best bet. So we really, in 2003, we developed what's called 1,000 Eyes program, and it's really a public outreach to let people know the importance and significance of the sites we manage, and also to engage the public in helping us with these activities. So some of the things we do are public engagements like this, sponsoring public lectures for archaeologists to come in and say, okay, this is the kind of information that we're finding out. Same thing with tribal members, having public outreach with them, having tribes come in and talk to local communities about the importance of their heritage, going to public schools and talking about archaeology and the protection of sites. A lot of times what we'll see, especially with surface collecting, the looting starts at an early age because it's a cultural tradition within that family. So we see kids being taken out to surface collect with grandpa or dad. And then also posting signage, letting people know that this activity is illegal. So just in conclusion, we are continuing to really aggressively pursue violations. We are also working with people like the Forest Service, National Park Service, and other federal agencies and state agencies to help us. Because like I said, there's 5 of us and a handful of ARPA investigators, and there's a lot of area to cover. And then that's where all of you come in, is really getting the public involved in this and understanding the importance of it, and really ramping up that program to give people that are very interested in not only Native American history, but it's all our collective heritage, an outlet that they can really use that for good. So we're trying to develop right now an archaeological monitoring program that would be run by, volunteers might be able to help monitor these sites, and asking them for help if you see looting on our land to please let us know. So in the back I have stickers if you want to take it, that has a number of who you contact if you do happen to see looting on TVA land. And that's all I have. I wanted to give enough time. Hopefully I didn't talk too long. I wanted to give enough time for Dr. Presley. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. So, how do you deal with private property where there's obviously a site there?
Private property, we have no say in it, and it's not covered by ARPA. Dr. Franklin's going to talk about a lot of times landowners have issues with this as well, people coming in and digging on their property as well. So there's people like Jay that work with private property owners to work things like that out.
Thank you, Michael Lynn. A couple of things. I'm not sure I need this, but I'll put it on anyway. couple things before I get started. Apparently it's the week of family emergencies, and that's why Aaron couldn't be here. But I also have a son at home recovering from an unannounced appendectomy, so I've got my phone out just in case he runs into any problems. His older brother's supposed to be there with him, but you know how that goes. And I'm not checking football scores, so I couldn't tell you that South Carolina's beating Mississippi State 17-7 right now. The other thing is the simple fact that Michael Lynn, that I wanted to make sure that I emphasize this, the simple fact that Michael Lynn was up here today to give this talk, got handed the hot potato just in the last 48 hours here or less than, is the remarkable history of stewardship that TVA has with archaeological sites and the archaeological record from day one. And it's a story I like to tell, and it's in a book, recounted in a book I'll mention in just a few minutes. But William Webb, and that's who I'm assuming you were talking about, the right bank, left bank.
Nieberg.
Was it Nieberg? Okay. William S. Webb, who was from TVA from the day one, when the federal government announced the creation of TVA, he actually went to and I can't remember the gentleman's name, the head of TVA at the time, and he said, hey, what would you think about before you inundated all these sites in the Tennessee Valley about, investigating some of the archaeological sites, the history of the entire region through here? And the guy said, that'd be a really great idea. I tell you what, why don't you write up a plan for me, and we'll go from there. And William Webb pulled a plan out of his pocket that he had already written up. He said, well, I've got one right here. And TVA has done this throughout their entire history. Erin Pritchard, who was going to come up today, just finished a book in 2009. I believe she was the editor and compiler of the book, 75 Years of TVA Archaeology. And it's a remarkable history of preserving, publishing, investigations of archaeological sites. So I really appreciate Michael Lynn coming up here and taking time out of her day to talk about this. What I want to do now is talk about, I think Michael Lynn made it clear why this is important, but to give you a specific example of some sites that we are looking at, just beginning to investigate, and maybe provide some historical context for why this is important to everybody. All the people that she mentioned, us as archaeologists, as land managers, as the interested public, and as Native American peoples. So, my own involvement, and I'll give you a little bit of a history lesson about our area, at least as it pertains to archaeology. My own involvement, this is my 10th year at ETSU, although I'm from East Tennessee. My wife went to school and played tennis here. When I got here, I had been asked to come out to Kingsport to look at some artifacts that were collected from the Long Island and the Holston when they made the baseball fields out there. And they were thinking about putting a little display out there of some of the artifacts they'd uncovered. And they asked me if I'd come out and look at them. And I said sure that I would do this. And in the process, I met a gentleman who worked for the city of Kingsport, whose father had been a member of the old Kingsport chapter of the old Tennessee Archaeological Society, and had dug at a site in the late 1960s, early 1970s called Holliston Mills down on Holston, and a big site with a big central, probably communal structure here, lots of different houses, pits, a lot of burials. The site had been palisaded at least a couple of times. In other words, they built a big wooden wall around it. But it had some very interesting pottery that came off of the site that in many cases came from the same pit context. This is a type of pottery that refer to an archaeological culture called Dallas, which is a late prehistoric culture that's really more typical farther down the Tennessee Valley as you get towards Knoxville and Chattanooga. Michael had mentioned the Hiwassee Island site. I think it's the last component there. But also some pottery from an archaeological culture that we call Pisgah, which was originally defined in the Summit region of western North Carolina. So early on, I thought, well, this is really strange. We have this mix of pottery from two different areas here at the same site, and near as I can tell, it looks like it's coming, in a lot of cases, from the same context. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about our work there, but we were able to cobble together a book chapter a few years ago, and this also are some ceramics, and I really meant to put the old Lamar map in here, from an archaeological phenomenon, for lack of a better way to put it, called Lamar. Lamar is a pan-regional southeastern expression in the lake prehistory that you find in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee. But that if you look at the Lamar Archaeology volume that was published in 1990, and you look at the distribution of Lamar pottery or Lamar characteristics, it does not extend up into our area. You know, maybe up as far as around Knoxville or so, but not in our area. But nonetheless, we had ceramics, both incised ceramics and complicated stamp ceramics from Holliston Mills that are clearly Lamar, a Lamar influence. Those designs you see on pottery, different shapes and sizes and different temper types all over the Lamar culture area. And when I first showed this to some of my colleagues who are far more versed in the late prehistory of southern Appalachia than I, they were really surprised and shocked that we had Lamar pottery from this site. So I'll come back to that. There's a lot of interesting things that kind of piqued my interest. And I'm really more of a hunter-gatherer archaeologist, really ancient sites, rock shelters up on the Cumberland Plateau in the southwest of France and the mountains of France. So my foray into the late prehistory and agriculturalist and village sites has just been in the last few years. This is a map we were able to put together of the Holliston Mill site. And just a couple things, the river, Holston River is down here. This is this big communal structure I was talking about. And I'm still working with a lot of these maps and notebooks, so hopefully I can figure some more out. But the imprints of several houses, at least a couple of different walls or palisades, stockades around the town. And then all the little dots in here are burials. The white ones are burials without grave goods. The red ones had grave goods. And altogether, I think they excavated something like 660 burials. This was before the NAGPRA laws and the burial laws and a lot of things that Michael Lynn was talking about. And we've got data records from about 598 of these represented on this map. But about 40% of them had grave goods with them. That's really also very uncommon for Mississippi, and in particular Dallas towns, where you have segregation of high-status individuals from the rest of the people there. And we don't see any congregation of high-status burials versus low-status burials. Lots of these people were buried with the grave goods. There's no separation based on age or sex either. So it's very, very interesting. It seems to be that wealth was fairly evenly distributed throughout this community at this site. I had a student do a project on this, and she was able to get both internal funding and some extramural funding, including from the National Science Foundation, just as an undergraduate student. And we got about 9 or 10 radiocarbon dates from the site. We did some trace element analysis on some of the pottery, but basically it represents a town that was in existence for about 200 years, from about 1350 to 1550. That Pisgah component, or the pottery that's representative of more of those North Carolina archaeological cultures, was first. Then you have a period of contemporaneity where it's mixed with that Dallas pottery, and the site goes out of existence around 1550, which probably coincidentally, although I'll talk some more about this in a little while, is about the time of the 2 Spanish entradas that came through the region. We don't have any evidence that either De Soto or Pardo ever stepped foot on this site, or even on the Holston for that matter, but these communities were probably not disconnected to sites where they may have been, and so it's this community's demise at around 1550, or at least this town's demise, may not be all that surprising. So as I began to research this, I found what few systematic archaeological investigations had been done in the area, because most of it was avocational, and there's not really, until I got here, not really been an archaeologist or a program on the ground in the region to investigate all this. But Bob Lafferty in the 1970s did an investigation on the Holston at Phipps Bend, what was then going to be the nuclear facility that never happened, and I don't know, it's probably best for all of us. But in any case, a really extensive archaeological investigation, one of the best reports. It's about 500 pages long, one of the best archaeological reports ever put together, very exhaustive and thorough. And he did say at the beginning, he's like, look, the stuff I'm throwing out in this report, because he recognized how little had been done in the area, is really sort of hypotheses or ideas that we need to test moving forward in the future. But he didn't find what we had at Holliston Mills just upstream, not too far. He didn't find that on Phipps Bend. Nice big broad open floodplain. It's kind of curious. And he said the Mississippian, or the late prehistoric era here, appears to be quite unintense. And I think he said some other things like corn agriculture may not have been terribly important. The subsistence base was little changed from the days of hunting and gathering. Well, this seemed rather odd to me, given the fact that we've got Holliston Mills just upstream, that clearly was this big town, big village, lots of houses, stockaded, protected, and at this site, and some others, including the ASG site, which is almost a stone's throw from Phipps Bend, we had smudge pits full of charred corn, and we know now that corn agriculture was part of this. Now, we've, in most cases, only just recorded a lot of these sites. I think, unfortunately, a lot of them are gone due to development and digging and stuff, although we're going to do some geophysical surveys here and probably up here in the coming future. But as we begin to get out in the community and meet people who in some cases had dug on some of these sites back in the day, and get on the ground and investigate it, a lot of times with my good friend S.D. Dean, we realized there was a lot to the late prehistory of our region, and a lot of it was very interesting and in close proximity to Phipps Bend. So I found this very interesting, but you know, part of the other reason that some of this may not have happened, and this is from an early TVA 1958 report, and I'm not really sure who penned this one, but when I talk about this, I always preface it by saying that you have to understand in these early days of archaeology, TVA and the fledgling program at UT under Madeline Nieberg and Tom Lewis, who later married, they were stretched thin. I mean, people called them in the avocational community all the time from all over the state, including the area where I work most of the time, the Cumberland Plateau, and said, hey, we have these really cool sites. Can you come look at them? Can you send somebody out? Can you? And they couldn't. They couldn't do everything. And TVA, in terms of some of their reservoir operations, were moving faster than quite frankly, archaeologists could handle. And sometimes that's just an unfortunate artifact of the way things go. But in a very brief part about this, and these are particularly Boone that we're going to talk about, no archaeological manifestations of any importance in the area, no permanent Indian habitation, no village sites. The Cherokees have probably been up here transiently collecting stone to make artifacts and their stone tools, and hence you find some arrowheads and projectile points out along the survey, but very different, I think, than what I've just showed you from Holliston Mills and some of the sites that I'm going to talk about today. And then the other thing is figuring out who these people were. I've always been sort of struck from a cultural perspective that, and I do this to students, at least in my intro classes on campus. I was like, you know, what's the most popular Indian tribe in the Southeast, or who would you expect is the most representative tribe of Southeastern cultural traits? And your knee-jerk reaction might be what?
Cherokee.
Cherokee. Everything's Cherokee. There's Cherokee County in just about probably every state in the South, or, you know, Cherokee this, Cherokee that, Cherokee Heights, Cherokee Bluffs, Cherokee. There are some historical records from Thomas Walker's explorations in 1750s, excuse me, as he moved through East Tennessee. And in it, he recounts, as he's just down below the forks of the Holston, he talks about an abandoned Indian fort that was stockaded along the Holston River. And that's pretty much what he says about it. And there's a couple other sentences, but none of which are very useful in terms of helping us today. But then later on in 1991, Muriel Spoden wrote about in a local Kingsport history, and I'm not sure what record she may or may not have been drawing from, but she recounts the same Walker thing, but refers to it as a Cherokee Indian fort. And I always found that very curious, because it's not been investigated archaeologically. There aren't any really, it was an abandoned fort, so we didn't encounter Cherokees in the area. well, at that place. There were Cherokees in the area, but that I'm aware of, no communications between Walker and Cherokee saying, yeah, that was our place. And so the assumption of Cherokee is not necessarily unreasonable. There was a treaty signed with the Cherokee on the Long Island in 1776, one in 1771 on the Nolichucky as well. It's just not demonstrated archaeologically. Now, there were some notable exceptions, again, from people who were never really on the ground here very long time. Howard Ernest Jr. grew up around here along in Chucky and was a Forest Service archaeologist for a long period of time. Cliff Boyd did his undergraduate years ago at East Tennessee State University. And there's been some other systematic investigations. So I don't want to be lax in mentioning those. Cliff's work on the Watauga Reservoir, Howard Ernest and Mac McElhenney did undergraduate and master's level projects, but survey, mostly surface collection projects on the Middle Nolichucky in the 1970s. And then Roy Dickens, Cliff Boyd, Tom White, and others who did some various excavations at the Plum Grove site. It's now owned by the U.S. Forest Service on the Middle Nolichucky, where the investigations they were able to do basically identified two late prehistoric components, probably towns or settlements. The radiocarbon dates in ceramics are kind of interesting, and they're still trying to get some new dates from the site, but they give a big time span, so they're not very helpful at this point in helping us sort out particulars about the late prehistory here, except for the fact that it gives us a general idea. I'll return just for a minute, and then we'll get off the Holston to Walker Stockaded Fort. A friend and a colleague of mine, Guy Weaver, did a survey for the Holston Army and Ammunition Plant several years ago, in the late 90s, I believe. And it's this landform here we're talking about, which encompasses sites 40 HW, 68, 71, and 72, which I think most of us believe is the most likely place Thomas Walker was talking about. And they found some artifacts here, some of which, particularly at 68 and 72, were shell-tempered, like we might expect more of that Dallas culture that we see farther downstream at Holliston Mills and farther down in southeast Tennessee. But they also recovered some pottery, particularly this one right here, that was tempered with coarse sand that very much looks like, and it's all that Lamar-influenced pottery, but looks like Qualla, which is the archaeological pottery we associate with the Cherokees because they were still making it well into the early part of the 1800s. The murals could have been right, and it certainly appears that this may have been the town. We've talked with the folks at HAP, Bruce Cole, their resource management person, and we've tentatively gotten permission to do some geophysical surveys there, ground penetrating radar to look at this further in the coming years. So I'm excited about that opportunity as well. So I want to come back over to the Watauga and these sites in and around Boone Lake, because whether archaeologists have known for a long time the history of this area and village sites and things like that, I think people who lived here have known this for a long time. And in a brief in the Old Tennessee Archaeologist Journal, and I'm not going to sit here and read this, I believe it's from the Clyde Lunsford collection. I guess he dug and collected out there for a number of years in the 40s and 50s perhaps, and I know some other folks who did as well, but found some artifacts in a couple of burials, unfortunately, where they found Native American artifacts with historic European or Euro-American artifacts, suggesting a contact period site. He also suggested a mixed population, and by that we're guessing Euro-American and Native American, but also pottery they identified as Cherokee. We assumed what they meant by Qualla. There are some, in talking to Howard Ernest and some others, was some pottery that came from the site that looked like stuff they found on some of the Nolichucky sites, but also some stuff that looks like that Dallas pottery that I knew came off here in the Holliston Mills and whatnot. But given the suggestion dating to about 1750, a late site, really historic era site. beginning in about 2006, although I think SD had known about the site for quite a longer time, but my friend and colleague and I, SD Dean, began collecting during winter drawdown some of these sites, and mostly he just was calling them to my attention. And we collected, beginning in 2006, we collected 4 or 5 sites. And I came back to school the next day, or I got on the internet, and I contacted my friends and colleagues at TVA, and I said, hey, did you know what's going on out here at Boone? There's all these sites below Pool that are eroding out of the bank, and people are digging on them and riding motorcycles and 4-wheelers all over the place. And they said, yes, we know about it, but Boone is a unique situation compared to a lot of other TVA reservoirs, is that TVA owns the water. And in the winter and the summer, the water's different. And so when we're walking these banks in the wintertime, we're walking private property tracts of people's lands, and it's something over the last several years I encounter all the time. I walk out and I can't really say much to anybody. People who are out there digging while I'm out there working, and I'd love to be able to say something to them, but from a legal perspective, I can't. And so this was frustrating. And then there were 2 or 3 times, and I think I wore some of my friends at TV out a little bit, because I'd let it sit for a couple of years, and I'd email one of them again and say, we got to do something about this. But like Michael Lynn said, it's private property. So, and we continued to collect these sites and keep an eye on them, and again, just kind of recording them for posterity's sake, because I didn't really know what else we could do. But in one of the last times we were out there, 2011 or 2012, I began to understand that we had pottery from some of our surface collections of these sites that was Qualla pottery, the pottery we associate with the Cherokees. So I thought, well, this is interesting. These sites are a little later, or maybe in some cases quite a bit later than what I thought. And this is a pottery rim vessel that looks just like pottery that comes off of some of the North Carolina sites, Coweta Creek. This is a cob roughened sherd, again, very typical of Qualla pottery. In doing this, I had I'll come back to that in a minute. There are also some unique looking pottery rims that come off the site. These are bird effigy heads on the rims of the pottery that aren't so very Qualla looking. And in point of fact, are more similar to some vessels that come even a little farther east on the other side of the mountains in the Catawba River Valley that we typically associate with Proto-Catawban speakers or the ancestors of the Catawba Indians. So an interesting mix of things from this site as well, and then some other really unique things. Another effigy that was probably mounted on the edge of a vessel. This one's a wood duck, or I keep trying to convince my student Christina this is actually a dinosaur. It's a Corythosaurus, and it's clear indication of Native American contact with dinosaurs. I'm kidding, of course. But the more I got to thinking about this, the more I got to thinking about context and what we could do. And we were already doing, up on the Cumberland Plateau where I've done most of my work, we were already doing a luminescence dating project up there. And one of the reasons we were doing it is because, and most of this is on private property, but is because people have been digging on those rock shelter sites up on the Cumberland Plateau where I work for maybe going on 150 years in some cases. It's very much a family and cultural tradition up there. It's very much a rite of passage. And mostly just from interested people who live, and their families have lived up there for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations in some cases. And so I joked with a good friend of mine who lives up there several years ago that I had more or less staked my career on the prehistory of the Cumberland Plateau. And there was a time there 4 or 5 years ago, 3 years ago even, where I wasn't really sure that was a smart idea because of in part, dealing with what information can we get from looted sites where things are just scattered on the surface. And it worried me, particularly as the economy got bad and people start slashing budgets. Maybe they start slashing archaeologists too, I don't know. So we developed this project to directly date artifacts, and pottery is a great one for doing it. luminescence dating. And we've been doing it on the plateau since about late 2007. But there's an even bigger reason to do this from an archaeological perspective. And Robert Dunnell, who was a very well-known archaeologist for several decades in American archaeology, he said this. He's like, the reality of it is, whether it's from a management perspective or a research perspective, those of us who are archaeologists, we mostly encounter the archaeology on the surface. Whether it's along Boone Reservoir or Gunnersville in Alabama, or an upland lithic scatter on top of a knob or a looted rock shelter, this is mostly how we get it. And it's not even close. The vast majority of these sites are surface sites. And we got to find a way to deal with them meaningfully, to incorporate them into our body of what we understand about how people lived in terms of dating them, important historical information. And luminescence dating can do this part of it better than radiocarbon dating. Now, I'm not saying it's better than radiocarbon dating, I'm saying in this. Because if you take something, an associated piece of charcoal from one of these sites where you have a piece of pottery laying, that charcoal may or may not be associated with that potsherd. It could be from where somebody burned a stump 50 years ago and your potsherd is 1,000 years old. But you don't know that if it's laying on the surface. If you were to find them in buried context together, that would be fine. But that's really iffy on the surface and probably not the case in point of fact. And radiocarbon dates are expensive. Luminescence dates are not so much, but since you're directly dating the artifact, you eliminate that problem of associations. And so, as Mike Lynn pointed out that I was going to bring up, archaeological material from disturbed context, whether it's dug up rock shelters, just a deflated riverbank site, can directly be dated and they can generate important chronological and historical information. And so we took that we were already doing on the plateau and began to apply it to these sites along Boone and the Nolichucky and the Holston. And I'm very happy to say, because in my discussions with the lab, we were a little worried that just the inundation, 6-8 months of the year, might affect it. But for the most part, our dates from these reservoir sites in Upper East Tennessee are coming back in a lot of cases better than our rock shelter dates on the plateau. So I had a student do a little project that she got some intramural funding for. And in that proposal that we wrote as a student-faculty collaborative grant, we hypothesized, because we knew we had a mix of ceramics coming off these sites, we hypothesized, well, this stuff that looks different, the shell-tempered, Dallas-looking stuff, it's earlier, maybe as late as 1550. But the stuff that we got that we think looks like Cherokee, we think that's later, after 1600, maybe after 1650, and they're not really related. And it reflects kind of like you saw with the overhill towns in southeast Tennessee when those Dallas cultures and maybe Muskogee-speaking cultures move out, the Cherokees move in and occupy the same areas, and that's historically what we know as the overhill, but that was after 1650. I assumed maybe we had a similar situation like that here. And as it turns out, and this is unfortunately part of what I think the general public doesn't get enough of from science and archaeology and stuff, is I was wrong. I was really wrong, but you don't really publish wrong results, or you don't get a lot of patting you on the back for wrong results. But it's information we could use. And we got these dates back on pottery. That's Qualla. Again, that pottery we associate with Cherokees. And it was way earlier than I thought. Late 15th century. So, okay, you get one or two dates, big deal. Well, here's another one that's a little later, early 16th century, but still much earlier than we expected on this incised Kuala Lamar pottery. Now, here's a date, same site, on some of this soapstone tempered pottery, complicated stamped soapstone tempered pottery. Now, soapstone comes from the mountains. You can't pick it up anywhere around here. So it's coming from the mountains anyway, but it's also more characteristic of those towns and sites really on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. And those cultures there that we associate with the Burke series of pottery, that was kind of like their more normal pottery. But we've got it over here. And what we're starting to understand is we've got it at a lot of sites. a lot of these sites on the, not so much the Holston, although a couple of sites, but certainly on the Watauga and the Nolichucky. And what we can also see is it dates about the same time. They statistically overlap, so it's here at the same time as Cherokee-looking Qualla pottery. And so this is very interesting. Now, I can't remember when, I think we got our first dates back around August of last year. We were getting ready to go to Virginia, to Roanoke, to the Uplands Archaeology Conference. So we're excited about the dates. It was interesting. I don't know if it's ever fun being wrong, but I guess it's fun being wrong if it's interesting, and this was getting really interesting. But then early in this year, after I read a couple of books by my now friend and colleague John Marcoux, and was made aware of these unpublished documents, I got really excited, because now we have some historical, confirmation is probably the wrong word, but historical corroboration for what we're finding archaeologically on the river from the Cherokees themselves, in the fact that they very much say they were in this area early on before, as Charles Hicks put it, they dispersed, as he said, presumably the rest of the nation split, but they mention the Nolichucky specifically, and they have in their own records, their own oral traditions, that they were here. Now, and this is not just a straight document here or there. And I had this conversation with we got invited, Michael Lynn was there as well too. We got invited last week by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians to come participate in their third annual Cherokee Archaeology Symposium. As she mentioned, one of these efforts to really get the archaeological, the management communities working together with Native American communities, with the Indian communities for a common interest, and it was a lot of fun and it was a good success. But Cherokee elders, particularly from the Eastern Band, have long held that the area of Upper East Tennessee was a special and important place to them. Hicks wasn't the only one who talks about this. Haywood, in his 1823 book on the Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee, also talks about Cherokee people telling him this. So there's not been a lot of archaeological work done in the area, but the Cherokee themselves, if they haven't advertised this information, they've known it for a long time and are very aware of it. And so, not just from the management perspective of protecting these sites on TVA land or in and around TVA land, or interesting research projects for me, we have a really unique opportunity moving forward to work with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, and they will be intimately involved in these projects, as will TVA, to bring out this history, their history that they speak of, and flesh it out, and I'm very, very excited about that. Now, just very close to the Austin Springs site is another site where we initially collected some shell-tempered pottery. Again, maybe more indicative of this Dallas culture. And again, a chronologically overlapping date. Now, given the fact that we know we have early Cherokee-looking pottery in the area, it could be that this pottery is not that Dallas culture. It could be early Overhill Cherokee pottery, and that is one of the things that we're going to investigate as we move forward too, because we know we've got a little bit of Overhill pottery from off of the Nolichucky very close by as well. But what it also indicates is all these potteries that we typically associate with different archaeological cultures, we have here in Upper East Tennessee now, and they're all contemporaneous. In other words, they're occurring at the same time. People are making and using them at the same time. What does that mean? Does it mean different peoples? Does it mean lots of trading going on, which is what some earlier scholars talked about? Does it mean coalescing of certain communities, different groups of people coming together and living here? I'll try and return to that. And then just last week, we got a couple more dates from the really very koala-looking pottery from the second site, very similar to the two pieces we had dated from the first site. And again, two exciting things. The dates overlap each other, they corroborate each other, and they're early. Okay, so the pottery that we very much associate with the Cherokee Indians, we've got it here and we've got it earlier, and I think it's safe to say that even as archaeologists, we kind of were beside ourselves for a while because this is a really exciting and important find, and we probably have maybe 250, 300 years of Cherokee history represented in the archaeological record here. Another interesting thing about it is that a lot of this pottery is very similar. In talking to some of my other archaeological colleagues who work in North Carolina, you know, they're like, this is koala, or this is very koala looking, and it wouldn't look out of place on sites in western North Carolina. Not exactly the same, but it wouldn't look too out of place. But it looks really different in a lot of cases than the Overhill Cherokee pottery that's farther south in Tennessee and a little bit later in time. So stuff that looks very Cherokee, very koala in a lot of cases, but different than other areas of the Cherokee world. Now, I mentioned earlier, I talked about this whole business of Lamar, and you can see, like, here's a map with koala sites, in other words, that pottery or that archaeological phase that we associate with the Cherokees. And here's Lamar. You can see the distribution is pretty much the same, except for Lamar itself extends a little farther down the Holston than does koala. So what is Lamar? Well, Lamar may be a lot of things, but it appears to be this pan-regional expression that peoples of lots of different groups, cultural groups, ethnic groups, shared, even though they maintained their own sort of ethnic traditions. They shared this stamping and this incising of pottery that some people, some of my colleagues think was a way of information exchange that may even have had sort of religious significance, but that they all shared, but that also have sort of their own regional tweaking or regional highlights about it. And so, you know, we know two things at this point, if we don't know much else, is that we know this Lamar influence or greater Lamar sphere extended well up into our region of Upper East Tennessee. We weren't disconnected, or the people who lived here weren't disconnected from the rest of the Mississippian world at all. The other thing I think on top of there just being potentially a long history of Cherokee sites here is that, and these are, you can see my slide title says selected sites. I didn't put all of them on here. I have some colleagues like Katie Sampek at Illinois State who's working with some sites down here. So I didn't put all of them on here, but that's not a village or two here and there on the river. These are perhaps dozens of towns or hamlets or communities. It doesn't, one of the things that archaeologists talk about is that you have these big chiefdoms farther south down here in North Georgia and southeastern Tennessee, and then over on the other side of the mountains at Warra and eastern North Carolina, and that this is kind of a frontier area on the periphery of these different chiefdoms and, you know, kind of scattered and dispersed. But here we have all these towns, and it doesn't look like they're on the edge of anything. So instead of these towns and villages in our areas of Upper East Tennessee being on the periphery of other places, I think they're probably their own culture area in and of themselves. And so why can't we speak about not so much a chiefdom? Because I think we have enough evidence to suggest there probably wasn't any sort of paramount chiefdom here, but a series of connected towns and villages that compose their own thriving communities over the course of 200 or 300 years that weren't on the periphery of anything. And if we could go back in time and interview them, they'd probably say that. This is our home. This is this land, this area right here. We're not outcast from this chiefdom or that chiefdom, but we're part of a thriving culture area and community here. One last little bit, and we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence for it on the Watauga, but there's some indications on our sites on the Nolichucky that we have clearly trade beads and some things like that, some Spanish contact, but about the route that the Spanish took when they came across, whether it's the DeSoto Entrada or the Pardo Entrada, as Katie Sampek puts it, there are, if you were to be able to Google this in right now, that the least amount of driving time would probably be a different route. But the idea of DeSoto being able to squeeze his army and dogs and pigs and all that through some of these mountain gorges is unlikely. And even though you got to cross the mountains at some point, a much more likely route, and other people have talked about this, was across the mountains from Wara, where the Spanish set up fort, is to come across and come down the Nolichucky, where they eventually encountered a big chiefdom town that's now under Douglas Reservoir at Chiaja, at Zimmerman's Island. And there's a growing bit of evidence to suggest that this was the case. I suppose, and we may be able to investigate this. That would certainly be an exciting component of the research. I guess my own concern about it, if you take the Spanish accounts literally, and you shouldn't probably, is that if there were a bunch of towns along the Nolichucky that were all thriving at the same time, as opposed to say one or two, it seems like there would have been more of a mention of that. But there's certainly some artifacts coming off of some of these sites that suggest that that may, in point of fact, have been the case. So we will certainly be mindful of that as we move forward. So, exciting times. We're excited about moving forward. Let me get to you.
In this contact with DeSoto, do you think this was with Cherokee peoples or previous
In
cultures?
here, East Tennessee,
Yes.
I don't know that yet. I'll finish up in just a minute. Although I'm getting really scared of saying who I think was here ethnically, but I'll revisit that in a few minutes if you'll just entertain me for just a little bit. So, exciting times. We have great dates that we've gotten off of surface collected artifacts, so we can fit these into our archaeological investigations. I think these are things that a lot of people will be very interested in, including funding agencies, so we're excited moving forward. But part of the issue is protecting these sites, to be able to investigate them, to preserve them in their own right. And Boone is a classic example. Here you can see these tire tracks. Somebody tried to run over SD, just inside of it. Is we have these great early sites here that are going to add a very significant and important chapter to Cherokee history here. But they're already threatened. Whether anybody ever goes out and digs them again, we're dealing with Boone Lake every year, the raising and lowering of the lake. On the Nolichucky and the Holston, when you get a lot of floods and stuff, you're dealing with the erosion of the riverbanks. So Mom Nature is not always very kind to us either in dealing with the archaeological record. But you add in artifact hunting, looting, and recreational activity, and the fact that, at least in the cases of a couple sites I've talked here today, that they're on private property, we can't even enlist TVA to help us out, and it frustrates us on both sides of that. Now, I will say at one of these sites, actually at all of these sites, we've gotten landowner permission to move forward and do work here. And in one case in particular, the landowner, I think, has also been working very actively with Washington County Sheriff's Office, and at least on the one site, it's very important to us. There were a lot less people out there milling around last winter, and we'll certainly be looking out for that. So that's some cause for optimism. At other sites, it got worse this last year. And I've been monitoring these sites for about 7 years now, and when I saw this, I was stunned, absolutely stunned. And I go out here about every year, and this site in particular just got hammered. Bear in mind, this is already a disturbed site, long since disturbed site, and people are still just out there digging away. They do the same thing in the rock shelters on the Cumberland Plateau, all to find something maybe that somebody missed. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to do anything else with this site. Fortunately, several years ago, we did get about 3 luminescence dates from it and a reasonable collection of pottery, so we can, in some ways, fit it into what we do. So the take-home message, and hopefully I've done a good enough job presenting how important these sites, in particular these early Cherokee sites, may be. But even as archaeologists who dig square holes and dig systematically and record everything and take lots of pictures, as one archaeologist said a number of years ago, a bit melodramatic statement, but the point is well taken, I think. Archaeologists are the only investigators who kill their informants in the process of interviewing them. And it's true. We destroy a site when we dig it, even if we do it really, really well and enlist a lot of different people from a lot of different fields to look at all aspects of it, the animal bones, the geoarchaeology, the plant remains, everything. We still destroy it. And you can't go back and redo it. There aren't any mulligans in archaeology. And so we've got to be very careful, all of us, and be very thoughtful about we do it. And that's where I think we need the help of everybody. And the idea is if we're going to go out and deal with these sites, it's just not to go out and dig. You know, I try and do field schools where I take archaeology students out and train them how to be archaeologists. But I have to be mindful of the fact that I just can't go and find a project every summer and get them out there and get them some digging experience so they can get some digging experience. I also have to teach them that we have to be problem oriented. We have to have questions that we want to answer, and we have to recover and record that information in the proper way, because we can't come back next year and redo what we did. And I have to be mindful of that too. And we also need the help of our community. The simple fact that you're here and interested in what we are doing, enough to come out and listen to me drone on this afternoon, I think bodes well. And I think moving forward with these projects, not only do we want to, I'm missing the slide. Well, not only do we want to involve TVA, cultural resources when necessary, not only do I expect that the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians will be very involved in a number of levels, including they have a very active archaeology program themselves now, sending students and people from their Tribal Historic Preservation Office over. I imagine when we get going on these local sites, and we're a little ways off from that right now in terms of excavation programs, that we will like to have volunteers from the community to come out and dig with us and see how we do things. I'll be very honest, I have good friends up on the plateau who have a history of digging and pot hunting. And instead of shaking my finger at them, it's very funny to me sometimes when I go in certain communities, people think you're an archaeologist and you have some sort of, I don't know, cachet or some sort of power, like I can flash a badge and take your artifacts from you or wrap you across the knuckle. I can't. So, and I don't think that serves any purpose. But I have friends with this background, and you know, and one of them, and he was kind of a hard sell, and it was our second year of one of our rock shelter excavations, and he looks down in our excavation block and he says, "Wow, I understand why you guys dig the way you dig now." And that was a really great moment for me, because I was like, wow, I finally made that progress. So I expect when we get to excavation programs with these local sites that we like to have members of the community, interested members, to come out and dig with us and see how we do things and see the information. Mike Lynn's right, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that when we find stuff, we aren't excited. You know, there's a discovery aspect to archaeology that I don't think, if you really love what you do, you never get over. But, and you can hook me up to a lie detector test, I promise, I get excited when I find that artifact in context, when I know that there's something, there's more than just, wow, this is really cool. This means something in terms of one of the questions that I've posed before we've gone out in the field. If that artifact, if I found it in such a context that it can help me answer, that's what really excites me now, and has really for a lot of years, is that, yeah, this is really cool, but what can we learn from it? And given what I've just told you about destroying the archaeological record as we excavate it, I want to squeeze it for all we can get out of it, because it's the best we can do at that moment. So I will quit boring you there. For moving forward, working with Eileen Ernenwine in our geosciences department, our next order of business, we're going to continue to date the ceramics from these sites. There's statistical measures. The more of them you have, the more confident you can be in your results. But we'll be going out to these sites with ground penetrating radar and magnetometer. We can do fairly quick surveys across this and pinpoint areas maybe where there are actual houses or there are elements of the stockade or the wall still left. to give us ideas about where to pinpoint more localized excavations moving forward. But it'll also give us an idea about some of the scope of these sites. Some of these sites may be 10 acres in scope. You just can't run out there with a shovel on a trowel and think you're going to find anything out unless you plan on living until you're like 175 or something. So we'll be doing that to help us plan excavation programs in the next year or two. So thank you very much for coming out and sitting through both of us. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
What are you doing with the artifacts you're finding?
They are in our labs, and I have a handful of students. A handful of students working on various research projects with the sites that I talked about today and some others as well. So we're, that's another important thing that we try and do is I try and involve students in the research so they can get an upper hand on their education and training. And so we're actively working with these collections right now. And actually 2 of them went with us to Cherokee last week and presented themselves. So. And as far as your question about who all these people were, that's a great question. And I think if we're both here 10 years from now and you ask me that question again, I might be equally vague. I think, we kind of do it in archaeology where we equate a certain artifact type or style with a certain group of people. And there's some historical basis clearly to do it for Qualla and Cherokee. But on the other hand, we have to be careful about it. And we have a lot of mixes of stuff here. The things that we need to find out, although early indications that a lot of these pottery types are contemporaneous, what does that mean? Does that mean there's a group of people living here that are Cherokee or otherwise, and they just trade and have lots of interactions with people, and there's stuff coming up and down the rivers, and that's why you see all this kind of stuff here? Maybe. Does it mean a group of people that we don't know archaeologically so well who live here and have contacts with all these other people? The Spanish talk about a group of people in this area called the Chisca that Swan and others believed were the Yuchi. I think most people accept they weren't the Yuchi. A couple of my colleagues have thought maybe that Chisca actually referred to the Shawnee, which would be interesting if you have Shawnee this far east, but certainly not impossible. I don't think they were clearly, if they were here, the only people here, and the historic records about the Chisca suggest that they, we better everybody run for the door. So it could be then, or it could be, because you certainly get this after European contact, both with the Spanish and the English. It's well documented, if not well understood, coalescence of different communities that may involve Cherokees, Chiscas, people from the South. I mean, we just don't know this yet. And being as though I was wrong about the whole Cherokees weren't here till later thing, I'm at this point even a little scared to speculate. And as I said, we may not know this in 10 years of archaeological excavation. It's certainly a goal of ours to figure this out, but equating artifact styles and classes with a particular group of people is very problematic. You have intermarrying among these groups and people bringing their own, and some of that, there may be some reason to suspect. We see rim treatments on vessels around here that suggest the Pisgah, Western North Carolina influence, although you find Pisgah stuff over a broad region. But then they're on vessels that are tempered with river mussel shell and cord marked, like you see farther south. Now, that's even a little different than finding 2 different kind of vessels in the same context, because those could be trade items. That's somebody imprinting sort of 2 different ways or communities of practice onto the same vessel, and we got a lot of that here. And so maybe you are getting some coalescence or intermarrying of people and not just trade.
Correct my impression that when DeSoto arrived in North Carolina, there's been a depeopling of the decrease in the population, dramatic decrease, and then after that, the Cherokee culture made a major extension to the south.
I think in certain areas, yes to the first part of that question. And to the second part of that question, yes, the Cherokees, Charles Hudson talks about that. They're enigmatic in the sense where, and if you look at a lot of southeastern groups, they're more or less on the decline after the Spanish and maybe already. The Cherokee, at least for a certain period of time, kind of are sort of on their way up. At this point in my life, I would, and I'm not sure I believed this several years ago, I would not care to say, though, that that means that they moved into the region. DeSoto, the word Cherokee itself, or Cherokee, or however, that's always been a problematic term, at least from the historical documents anyway, because it means something like different people or people of another culture. And but they were here during both Entradas. I think a little bit more of a presence when Pardo came through, if I'm not mistaken. But and yes, they're Iroquoian speakers. A lot of the other the Muskogee is the native language group of the South, if there is one. At Wara, the people were probably Catawban speakers. Here, were probably Catawban speakers or Proto-Catawban speakers. So. You know, there's sort of some circumstantial evidence for that, but it's my understanding that a lot of linguists who have looked at the Cherokees as related to other Iroquoian speakers, and based on their work, there's a great time depth of separation, meaning that the Cherokees may well have been in the South for a very long, long time, even though some archaeologists think they're relatively or comparatively late arrivals as compared to some other groups, but I don't know.
Jay, can I say something?
Sure.
So I think some of that argument, too, is an artifact actually of TVA's work, especially during the 1930s. There was large-scale excavations of all these reservoirs, and a lot of the researchers that were working in that time, some, Jay mentioned Madeline Nieberg and Lewis and William Webb, the changes through time they saw as far as artifact styles of different life ways, it always had to be because a new group was moving in. So you have what we call the Dallas culture, and then you see a change within the later period stuff, say Mouse Creek phase, which is down in lower southeast Tennessee, and then with some of the Cherokee, the later over here stuff, and it must have changed because